Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Happy Saturday. This is the Korean War and the Korean War Veterans Memorial live stream program. Let's go ahead and get started. If you haven't done so already, we always welcome people to introduce themselves in the Zoom chat or the Q&A. Or if you're watching live on Facebook, you can let us know your first name, where you're connecting from, and do you have any connections to the country of Korea or to the Korean War? It's always fascinating to find out where people are joining us from and to learn more about them. We don't do a Zoom demonstration for these programs, so just very quickly, there's usually only a couple things that people ever have questions or concerns on if you're watching us live. One is the sound and the other is the screen display. So everyone will be in listen only mode or muted. If you do want to raise or lower the volume on your session, you can check the settings locally on your own device. We did a sound test earlier and everything seems to be working fine. If you want to adjust the screen display so that the slides and the videos that we're showing take up the full screen, if that's not currently happening because there's these black boxes that have people's names in them, you can make those go away at your end by looking for something on your device called either view or view options, and you can click off the side-by-side mode. Usually that's at the top of a person's device. Throughout our program, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, opinions, ideas, perspectives, memories, etc., please let us know in the Zoom chat or the Q&A or the comment section on Facebook. It's always fascinating to find out what people are thinking. And actually, one of my favorite parts of doing these programs is hearing what all of you think. So let's go ahead and get underway. We're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. We give people the opportunity to experience the history and culture not only of Washington, D.C., but of the world. I'll be your co-host. My name is Robert Kellerman. I'm the founder and director of the Washington, D.C. History and Culture Organization. And tonight, we are very fortunate that we have a special guest joining us, my good friend, Mr. Harry Phillips. Harry, you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm in Northern Virginia, a little bit outside of Washington, D.C.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Harry. Harry's an expert on Arlington National Cemetery. He's led many tours of Arlington Cemetery, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And this photo was actually taken when Harry and I visited the White House, and we were on our way to the Oval Office, which we'll talk about that some adventure someday in the future. So, and a big shout out to our friends who are joining us from Facebook, the Korean War Pics and Stories Facebook page. If you want to learn more about the Korean War or share in various discussions on this topic, check out their page on Facebook. It's called Korean War Pics and Stories. A recent discussion we were having on the group the other day, and you can chime in through our chat in Zoom or the Q&A if you like to. Do you have any recommended films and or documentaries that you've seen on the Korean War? They have a really fascinating discussion taking place in the Facebook group, which again is called Korean War Pics and Stories. So shout out to our friends joining us from there. And this is part one of a three-part program we're having on memorials here in the United States. The one tomorrow is on the Vietnam War and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Hopefully you can join Harry and I at the same exact time tomorrow. This program will be using a different Zoom information and of course a different topic, but hopefully you can join us for that. And then in early December, we have a program on the Pearl Harbor Memorial in Hawaii for the 80th anniversary. Now, before we get to that, I have a question for all of you. Curious to know where everyone is joining us from today. So hold on for 1 second. Let me launch our poll question. So where are you joining us from tonight? Are you in the Washington, D.C. metro area? Are you in the United States, but outside the Washington, D.C. metro area? Or are you joining us from outside the United States? It's always, again, fascinating to find out where people are joining us from. So I will leave that open for a few seconds and let you respond to that, and then I'll share the results. Let's see, it looks like we have a pretty geographically diverse group today. Okay, let me go ahead and I'll end the poll and share the results. So it looks like about a third of you are from the DC metro area, 62% are from the United States, but outside the DC area, and 4% are and international. Usually we have a lot more international folks if the program is earlier today, earlier in the day, because we have a lot of folks joining us from London often, but they can't be with us tonight because of the time difference. So let me stop sharing those results. I closed out the poll results. If those still pop up on your screen, you can just X that out or minimize that. And today, of course, we're going to be talking about the Korean War and the Korean War Veterans Memorials. Let's go ahead and get underway. So this is really a 4-part program. What we're going to do for the first part is talk about the Korean War, in particular the historical context behind it. I feel like that's really important because the memorial makes more sense if you understand the war that was fought. And then in part 2, Harry is going to take us through some of the more noteworthy, interesting people that are buried at the Arlington National Cemetery, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., that have connections to the Korean War. So that'll be part 2. Part 3 is we'll talk about the memorial itself, the one in Washington, D.C., and at the very end, part 4, we'll take your questions and comments that you may have. Oftentimes when we do these programs, we're not able to respond or have a Q&A type session, but tonight we are, so look forward to hearing what you have to say about that. So let's do a brief kind of overview of the Korean War, which broke out on June 25th, 1950, and it ended on July 27th, 1953. So some historical context of the Korean War before we start getting into the Arlington Cemetery and the memorial section. And Harry, feel free to chime in whenever you would like to do so. So first question, kind of a rhetorical question for all of you. If you're thinking about just strictly in terms of the United States, because we're a US-based organization and most of our participants tonight are joining us from the United States, was the Korean War a win, a loss, or a tie? What do you think? So you can ponder that one. Let's talk about the Korean War. So just a quick geography lesson if you're not exactly sure where Korea is. Here's a map of Asia, northern Asia, and you can see in the blue box, Korea is in between China and Japan, northern section of Asia. How did the Korean War begin? It has a really fascinating history. What happens is at the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union and the other allies are figuring out how they're going to administer these different locations in the world. And in Korea, it previously had been run by the Japanese after the Japanese took over the peninsula of Korea. So the Soviet Union and the United States decide to divide the country up at the 38th parallel. The Soviets will be kind of in charge of administering the northern section of the Korean peninsula, and the United States will be responsible for managing the southern section. Interestingly enough, how was the 38th parallel picked? Well, it was 2 guys at the State Department in Washington, D.C., and they were looking at a National Geographic map, and they were trying to figure out what would be a good dividing point between the Soviet zone and the U.S. zone, kind of maybe similar to how Berlin was divided up after World War II, if you're familiar with that situation. So they're using this National Geographic map, and they thought the 38th parallel was kind of a nice dividing point. It kind of split the country geographically in half, and so that's how the border gets established, kind of a random fact there. And what happens is the Soviets end up being heavily involved in the northern section, so it turns communist, and the southern section, which is the US-backed government, has more of a democratic focus. And the current leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, he's actually the grandson of the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. You can see there's only been 3 leaders in North Korea since 1948. They've had a pretty stable political structure in terms of the person in the top position. And it's interesting, Kim is in the news frequently. You've probably seen his face on a regular basis, either in print media or broadcast media or the internet, things like that. And what happens is his grandfather ends up aligning himself with Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union and Mao of China. Now, during this time, the Soviets and then also later the Chinese are really interested in expanding communism, and they find a welcoming ally in Kim of North Korea. And his goal is to unify the Korean Peninsula under communism, not have it a divided country between communists in the north and Democrat or democracy in the south, but all one unified country and all under communism. So this is Kim's goal, the current leader's grandfather. Now, to go shift gears a little bit, talk about the United States. The Korean War starts just a few years after the end of World War II, which, for kind of a United States perspective, took place from 1941 to 1945. And factoid for you, there were over 400,000 American military personnel killed during World War II. And for various reasons, the United States a little bit late to the party, so to speak, in terms of World War II. At that point in time, the United States was much more of a isolationist type of country where we didn't really get involved as much in foreign affairs. That may be kind of surprising for some people, just because now the United States gets actively involved in a lot of different things around the world, for better or for worse. But at this point in time, in the days leading up to World War II, the United States not really directly involved. And so that leads the Nazi Germany regime and the Imperial Japan regime to expand territorially and take over large sections of geography. And so by the time the United States does get involved in World War II, the Nazi Germany Empire and the Japanese Empire have greatly expanded geographically. And so the United States, kind of one of the takeaways from World War II is, if there's this expansion or this aggression in the future, we're not going to be late to the party. We're going to get involved early and try and proactively nip this in the bud, so to speak. And so you have something formulated called the Truman Doctrine, which is a key component of the Cold War. And so another kind of rhetorical question for you is, how concerned are you about the spread of communism? Is this something that you think about on a regular basis? Does this keep you up at night with all your other concerns that you may have? And, you know, it's kind of like saying that half jokingly, because most people are probably like, no, I'm not concerned about the communists taking over the world. However, back in the 1940s, this was something that a lot of people were concerned about, particularly in the United States. And you frequently see different kind of media outlets talking about the communist threat and Joseph McCarthy and the Red Scare and all that kind of stuff. So this may seem like something that's not really that big of a deal now, but for people of the Korean War era, this was really important for them. Enter President Harry S. Truman. He was our president towards the end of World War II, up through much of the Korean War. And Truman gets involved proactively in the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan and various other efforts, which are really designed to help spread democracy. You can see the New York Times headline over on the right: Truman acts to save nations from red rule, asks $400 million to aid Greece and Turkey. So Truman is proactively getting the United States involved in the affairs of Greece and Turkey to try and prevent those countries from turning communist. The State Department building in Washington, D.C., picture of that is in the bottom right corner, is actually named the Harry S. Truman Building. The reason being is because the State Department's kind of whole strategy or mission since the time of Harry Truman has largely been focused on the Truman Doctrine of containing and limiting communism. So you have the Cold War and the Truman Doctrine. In the Korean War, takes place from June 25th, 1950 to July 27th, 1953. Most of that time, the administration of Harry S. Truman. And if I could only show you one slide for this whole entire section on the Korean War, I would show you this one, because it does a great job of explaining the war and how it took place. So moving from left to right, if you look at these four maps, on June 25th, starting point of the war, you have the communist northern section of the Korean Peninsula, and you have the democratic-backed southern section of the Korean Peninsula. And then the invasion takes place. The North ends up invading the South. The communist North ends up invading the democratic South. And using the word democratic a little bit loosely, the democracy in Korea was different than the one here in the United States. So before someone freaks out and starts typing in the comments that the South Korea wasn't the democracy the way the United States was, yes, of course it was not. But that being said, it was still a democratic government. And so the war breaks out and the North ends up invading the South and really drives the Southern forces all the way to this little section here, this bottom southeastern section of the peninsula. And things at this point in time in mid-September are looking very grim, as it looks like the communists are going to be able to take over the whole entire country. But there's a big shift that takes place. The United States military ends up having an invasion at a spot called Incheon, and this is one of the big turning points of the war. It totally catches the communists by surprise. They end up pushing the communists back north, almost to the border with China. And then the Chinese end up intervening and they turn around and drive the democratic-backed forces in the United States and the other allies back to kind of almost the original starting point. So really a kind of a quick synopsis of the war and how it ends up taking place. Before we get too further ahead, Harry, anything that you want to add about the maps or anything that we've discussed so far?
No, I assume you're going to mention about the United Nations resolution and the other countries
Oh
involved.
yeah, yep, coming right up. You're right on cue, pretty much. This was really big news, as you can imagine, when war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. For a number of people around the world, including in the United States, had not heard of Korea or were not very familiar with it. So you can see here's two examples of newspaper headlines: Northern Southern Koreans at war. Truman orders U.S. Air Navy units to fight in aid of Korea, et cetera, et cetera. So big news story. And this was only a few years after the end of World War II, kind of caught people off guard. So that kind of rhetorical question for the United States: was the Korean War a win, a loss, or a tie? And you still see a lot of debate about this. Even today, historians going back and forth in this. My own personal opinion is, if you look at the United States military and political objectives, there were three primary ones. Number one, the overall objective was to contain communist aggression. Number two was to prevent World War III. So yeah, contain communist aggression, but do so without starting World War III. And then the third military/political objective was to expel the North Koreans from South Korea. And so if you look at how things shaked out when the war was over, you can really say that all three of those objectives were accomplished. Now there's quite a few other things going on as well. And I wanted you to hear this press conference from Harry S. Truman, where he came on national television and explained why he felt strongly that the United States should get involved in the Korean conflict. So let's hear from President Truman. Let's pretend that we're going back in time and going to be watching this on video at some kind of theater. This is mostly before televisions were available. So you might have been able to see this news clip if you went to the cinema or the film theater. They would sometimes play these before movies, or you could be listening to it on your radio.
My fellow Americans, I want to talk to you plainly tonight about what we're doing in Korea and about our policy in the Far East. In the simplest terms, what we're doing in Korea is this: we're trying to prevent a third world war. The communists in the Kremlin are engaged in a monstrous conspiracy to stamp out freedom all over the world. If they were to succeed, the United States would be numbered among their principal victims. It must be clear to everyone that the United States cannot and will not sit idly by and await foreign conquest. The only question is, when is the best time to meet the threat, and how is the best time to meet it? The best time to meet the threat is in the beginning. It is easier to put out a fire in the beginning when it is small than after it has become a roaring blaze. And the best way to meet the threat of aggression is for the peace-loving nations to act together. If they don't act together, they are likely to be picked off one by one. Their aggression against Korea is the boldest and most dangerous move the communists have yet made. The attack on Korea was a part of a greater plan for conquering all Asia. I would like to read to you from a secret intelligence report.
Okay, we'll skip over that part. But anyway, you get the point. President Truman talking about the fact that the best time to deal with a fire is when it's small before it turns into a roaring blaze. And that really is largely a response to the American experience during World War II, when Japan and Nazi Germany really took off and ended up taking over large swaths of territory. So the Korean War, another interesting facet that some people might not be familiar with, it wasn't just the United States and the South Koreans against the North Koreans and the Chinese. There were actually a number of other countries that participated in the war as part of the United Nations effort to contain the communist aggression. And you can see over on the right the number of countries that sent combat forces or military troops to the Korean Peninsula. And then a number of countries also assisted with humanitarian aid. So again, it wasn't just the United States and South Korea. That's a very important point. Oops. There were 53 nations of the UN that condemned the invasion of South Korea. Poster from that. So why were the North Koreans able to have so much initial success against South Korea? Well, let's take a look at that. So if you can see the population of South Korea, it's actually at this point in time, June 1950, almost twice as much, actually more than twice as much than the North. But if you look at the number of troops, the North Koreans have 150,000, the South Koreans have 98,000. And look at the number of tanks. One of the big problems that the South Koreans had was they didn't have any way of stopping the North Korean tanks for the first few weeks of the war. And then also the fighter planes is a big discrepancy. So even though South Korea has a lot more population at this point in time in history, the North Korean military was significantly stronger, and the United States does not have a military presence in South Korea at this point in time, although of course that's about to change. You can imagine this was big story in the news in the United States when the war broke out. And just to go through some photos, apologies, this one is a little bit disturbing, but eventually US troops do land on the Korean Peninsula, but they're really doing nothing more than delaying the North Koreans' advance until more troops can get there. There were a number of Americans that were taken prisoner and executed, including this gentleman. And the war is not going well early on for the United States and the South Koreans. The first troops that land in South Korea from the United States military are really doing nothing more than trying to slow down the North Korean invasion as much as they can, but they're very limited in terms of their numbers and their equipment and their materials and things like that. This is probably one of the most famous photos of the Korean War. It's a black and white photo that someone colorized a portion of it. They didn't colorize the whole thing, but I thought it was pretty cool because of the colorization of this black and white photo makes it look much more realistic. And the context of this photo, if you've ever seen it before, or even if you haven't, is this gentleman went to the supply officer and told him that his troops were running out of ammunition and they desperately needed more ammunition. And so he's just been told, there is no more ammunition. You're just going to have to use what you have. And so thus the grim look on his face. And so at this point in time, we're over at kind of map 2 from the left. And you can see the communists have driven the South Korean military and the small numbers of American military down to this kind of perimeter here on the peninsula. And they very easily came close to completely taking over the whole entire country, but the forces were able to hold out in this particular section. And then this big turning point takes place where there's this invasion. Douglas MacArthur comes up with this plan to launch an amphibious attack at Incheon, which really ends up turning the tide of the war, at least temporarily. Of course, to do that, they need troops from the United States. So American servicemen say goodbye to their friends and family, and off they go to Korea. Oops. Here's a picture of Douglas MacArthur. He was the hero of the Pacific War against the Japanese during World War II. He's in charge of the overall military forces in Korea, at least initially. So Douglas MacArthur, the hero of World War II, he's tasked with winning the Korean War, at least initially. And he comes up with this really bold, daring plan to do this amphibious attack at this place called Incheon, which a lot of the people at the Pentagon thought that this was crazy and it wasn't going to work and it was too risky or dangerous. But MacArthur, being the legend that he was allowed to proceed. And guess what? It actually did work. It really caught the North Koreans by surprise. This is the beach at Incheon. I think this is about 24 hours after the invasion took place. The United States troops landed here. It was, if you're familiar with D-Day, it was kind of, sort of, not really exactly like a D-Day type invasion of this section of the peninsula. The United States and the South Korean allies start fighting in Seoul. This is actually interesting. This photo is from Seoul, the capital of South Korea. And you can see when the communists took over, they had already put up their kind of communism posters and whatnot on the buildings. At this point in time, the U.S. military has started deploying in and around the Korean Peninsula, including Navy ships that are able to bombard the areas inland, jet fighters. This is the first kind of widespread use of jet airplanes. So it takes a while, but eventually the U.S. military might arrives in the Korean theater to help turn the tide. There's a lot of bombing taking place. This is the first use of helicopters. Helicopters are closely associated with the Vietnam War. As far as the U.S. military goes, they got their start, though, in Korea. It was during the Truman administration that Harry Truman wiped out desegregation in the armed forces. That was also a noteworthy event that took place during this time frame. Prior to this, you had white units and black units fought separately and were organized separately, but now they're integrated. It's an important part of the civil rights movement in the United States. Not just Americans were fighting in the war. There were, and South Koreans, there were a lot of other countries, including the British and the Australians and many others. And the war is going pretty well at this point in time because it's all these other countries, including the United States and South Korea and their United Nations allies, against North Korea. And so they're achieving a lot of success at this point in time. However, there's a tide's about to turn, because what happens is, oh, these are just some more photos. These are some, most of the kind of well-known photos of the Korean War, and I tried to put them in chronological order just so you can get a sense of how things were going. One of the more noteworthy things about Korea is how cold it is in the winter and how hot it is in the summer. The troops had to deal with that. These are folks marching along in the cold. And eventually, though, when the United Nations allies get close to driving the North Koreans back or into China, the communist Chinese army intervenes, and this turns the tide the other way. And so the Chinese play an active role in the Korean War, but not initially. It was a while before their troops intervened. And from there, things aren't looking as rosy as they were earlier. You see a lot of, I always think these photos are interesting during military times where you see people kind of connecting more with their faith, as shown in these two examples. So again, we kind of talked about this. Was the war a win, a loss, or a tie? It's really debatable. Interesting thing that happens is when President Harry Truman fired General Douglas MacArthur. Truman and MacArthur did not get along well. Truman felt like MacArthur should be following the orders that he was receiving from Washington, and MacArthur felt like Washington was meddling too much in the war, that he should be given free rein to do as he saw fit, especially after his big victory at Incheon. He just thought that He knew what was best, more so than the folks in Washington. So they end up having this spat, and Truman fires MacArthur. And so his reign as leader of the United Nations forces was from June 25th, 1950, when the war broke out, until April 10th, 1951. And this was really big news. There has not been many events like this in American history or American military history, where the president fired the head of the armed forces in a theater. Maybe Lincoln during the Civil War, but not really many other times since then. You can see the New York Times headline: Truman relieves MacArthur of all his posts, finds him unable to back U.S. UN policies. Then Ridgway named to Far Eastern Commands. I thought I would play this clip from a press conference that Harry Truman gave, explaining the firing of Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur wanted to be much more aggressive militarily. He wanted to attack the Chinese within the country of China. Truman and some of the folks in Washington wanted to limit the war to the Korean Peninsula. There's a lot more to it than just that. That's kind of the oversimplified version. But let's hear what Harry Truman has to say about the removal of Douglas MacArthur.
The question we have had to face is whether the communist plan of conquest can be stopped without a general war. Our government and other countries associated with us in the United Nations believe that the best chance of stopping it without a general war is to meet the attack in Korea and defeat it there. I've thought long and hard about this question of extending the war in Asia. I've discussed it many times with the ablest military advisors in the country. I believe with all my heart that the course we are following is the best course. I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders, but the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
Okay, so one of those moments in history that people are still debating today, whether or not President Truman did the right thing. So this was a huge news story all over the world, particularly in the United States. You can see over on the left, Truman says ouster of MacArthur is moved to block World War. Over on the right, New York gives MacArthur biggest mass tribute in American history. So Douglas MacArthur was a hero, and the fact that Harry Truman fired him was shocking to many, many people. They end up having this huge ticker tape parade for Douglas MacArthur, the guy who was fired, in New York City. So just really kind of an interesting point in history. This was a fascinating quote from Harry Truman that he gave a number of years later about this event. He said, quote, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a blank, although he was. But that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail." And so a famous quote from Harry Truman several years after the events that involved Douglas MacArthur. So again, another rhetorical question: did President Truman do the right thing in firing General Douglas MacArthur? What do you think? It's a really debatable topic. There's people still talking about this even this day. So the war continues on. This is a really neat photo. These are some troops eating their Thanksgiving dinner. You can see they're chomping on some turkey legs there. This photo went viral. This is, well, back when photos, back before they had the internet, this photo went viral. So this soldier was fighting, and he found this stray orphan kitten. And so he got some condensed milk and put it in this little tube thing and started feeding it. and some photographer snapped a photo. It ended up getting sent over to the United States, published in all these news magazines, in newspapers. And again, it really went viral before we even had a term for such a thing. This gentleman actually said that later that he received all kinds of marriage proposals from women that saw this. And so really kind of an interesting photo. You may have seen this one before, also one of the more well-known photos of the Korean War. There was a huge amount of damage done to the country of Korea during the war. This is a civilian section that's been bombed out in Seoul. This is a famous photo. This picture actually won the Pulitzer Prize. What's happened here is this bridge has been attacked and it's been damaged and it's mostly sunk into the water. And there are South Koreans that are trying to get to the other side of the river because the North Koreans are over here and they're approaching, and the South Koreans civilians are trying to get away from them. So imagine just grabbing what you could from your home and trying to flee for safety. This bridge has fallen into the water, but these people are trying to get across it the best way they can. So just a very shocking photo, won the Pulitzer Prize. This is a soldier that had his hands bound and was killed, a South Korean soldier. Oftentimes in war, people that are impacted the most are civilians. This is a young girl who was a refugee, and she's carrying her younger brother to safety. Another famous Korean War photo. And we had our map here that kind of showed how things went out. So again, the war breaks out, the North invades the South, drive everyone down to this perimeter here. Then there's the Incheon landing, turns the tide, things are going well, but then the Chinese intervene. They push the United Nations allies back almost down to the original starting point of the 38th parallel, and that's where the war ends up coming to a conclusion. Dwight D. Eisenhower succeeded Harry Truman as president, and he ends up negotiating or continuing the negotiations to end the war, and he was able to get a peace agreement. And the United States troops and their allies pack up, and most of them come home. And it's left up to the civilians of South Korea, including the children, to see what their future has in store. So we talked before about that rhetorical question of who won the war. What about from the South Korean standpoint? Do South Koreans think the United States lost the war? This is an interesting series of satellite photos taken at night to show you the difference between South Korea here and North Korea here. This is satellite photo 1 of 3. To give a shout out to my friend Michael Draper for sending me these. Here is another view. And a third view. And satellite photos taken from space in the evening, and this is the South Korean peninsula, here's the North Korean peninsula, here's China, and then here's Japan. And this photo or this series of photos just really shows the disparity between the economic development of South Korea and the North. And again, to go back to that question, do you think South Koreans believe that the United States won or lost the Korean War? And as far as the military political objectives, contain communist aggression, prevent World War III, and expel the North Koreans from South Korea. If they could have unified the Korean Peninsula under a democratic government, the United States and their allies would have been happy to do so, but they weren't. And so you can kind of say that they did these 3 things, maybe did not do as much as maybe some people were hoping, but the results of that is still debatable. And so again, our rhetorical question for the United States: was the Korean War a win, a loss, or a tie? No right or wrong answer, but people have different opinions. So what do you think? And with that, I want to turn things over to my good friend, Mr. Harry Phillips, who I've known for a long time. Harry leads tours of Arlington National Cemetery, and he was kind enough to come tell us about some of the noteworthy individuals that are buried at Arlington National Cemetery that have a connection to the Korean War. And I thought this would be good because it would give people kind of an example of some of the different types of people that were involved in the Korean War. Most people have heard of Douglas MacArthur and are familiar with his role in the Korean War, but what about all the other people that were over there? Harry's going to talk about a few of those. So Harry, take it away. It's all yours. And when you want me to switch slides, just let me know.
Okay. Yeah, this is a photograph of when they do the wreaths at Arlington, usually in December. That event is coming up again this year. Just a little introduction. I am not a veteran, but my father was a career naval officer and Naval Academy class of 1951. And both he and my mother's remains are in the columbarium at Arlington National Cemetery. So I feel a connection to the place. I never did create an actual Korean War tour, but I learned a lot about veterans and people connected to the Korean War through the other tours that I created and led. And I am hoping to restart doing actual tours in the spring.
So Harry, tell people about your tours that you do, because we have a lot of folks that are joining us from outside of Washington, D.C. that may not be familiar with them.
Well, my inspiration goes back to 2015 when I met Robert, and the cemetery started as a military cemetery in the Civil War. So I thought what would be interesting would be to do an actual Civil War focused tour of the cemetery to talk about how it started and to see, you know, some of the headstones of the first soldiers buried there, and talk a little bit about the history of it. And so Robert encouraged me, and so then I've created, you know, tours dealing with the Second World War. I created in the last couple of years, I created a tour about D-Day specifically, and also one about astronauts that are buried at Arlington. So there are a lot of interesting topics. There are what I think over 400,000 buried at Arlington. So the first person I want to talk about, who's not maybe that well known, is General Walton Walker. And he had a very sort of serious long career in the United States military. He serves under Patton during the Second World War, and then is well known to MacArthur, and MacArthur uses him as, you know, MacArthur's headquarters is in Japan, and Walton Walker so then is the general on the ground in Korea who's going to be responsible for the U.S. 8th Army, which has both U.S. and Korean soldiers. And he's the one who is responsible for holding the line. You saw the map before about the North Koreans pushing the Allied troops into the south. That little foothold was called the Pusan Perimeter. And Walker is responsible for holding that perimeter and coordinating with MacArthur when the Incheon landing takes place. So then he's also responsible when the Allies push north to the Chinese border, and is surprised, like everyone else, when the Chinese come pouring across the border and pushing the Allied troops back, you know, south. And he tragically dies in an automobile accident in Seoul, Korea, in December. So just within a few weeks of when the Chinese launched their attack against the Allies. Now, this statue of Walker is actually in South Korea at the 8th Army headquarters. It was moved recently when the headquarters moved. But it was actually donated by the Republic of Korea U.S. Alliance Friendship Society, and it's fairly recent. It was erected in 2010 during the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War. And this is Walker. You can see at the very bottom of his headstone, they use abbreviations for the medals that he's been awarded. And you can see that he's a very highly decorated soldier.
Harry, were there any other kind of examples like that of someone at such a high level position being killed during a war on the American side? It's kind of a rare occurrence.
You know, of course, the other one that a lot of people are familiar with is that Patton died in an automobile accident after the armistice. After the armistice in.
You were going to say General Custer
in Germany. Well, yeah, of course. Custer was killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Walker had more troops under him than General Custer did.
I think so, yeah. Now, one of the other sort of important leaders is Marshall. And he, George Marshall, Robert mentioned the Marshall Plan. And, George Marshall had been sort of the, FDR's right. He was the chief of staff of the Army during the Second World War. And he had been incredibly important in building up the Army during the Second World War and sort of keeping it together. And after the war, he had several positions. But when the Korean War broke out, he was actually Truman's Secretary of Defense. He was 70 years old at the time. And he took the job in September of 1950 and would hold that position for a year. Now, when the conflict came up between, Marshall knew MacArthur very well from the Second World War. And when the conflict between MacArthur and Truman came up, Marshall, realized that this could be a big problem and tried to defend MacArthur. And Truman said, "Go look at all the communications between me and MacArthur in the last few years." And Marshall did that, and he came back and said, "Yeah, you're probably right. He does need to be fired." So Marshall kind of came around, but a very, very important person in the American military history in the 20th century.
And he's buried at Arlington.
His headstone. You'll see the Congress created the 5-star rank during the Second World War, towards the end of the Second World War, and there have only been 9 men who have held that rank, including the next person who I want to mention, who is Omar Bradley. Bradley also had a very important role in the Second World War, serving under Eisenhower. And the military has kind of a reorganization after the Second World War, and they create the structure that we know now as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Bradley is the very first chairman of the Joint Chiefs in this sort of post-war reorganization. And he was the last person to receive the 5-star rank, which he did receive in 1950. Now, Bradley had never been a big fan of MacArthur, so he didn't have any problem with the fact that Truman had decided to let him go. And these are photographs from Bradley's funeral. And his headstone. Now, one of the other questions that I thought about was, who's the most famous veteran of the Korean War? And of course, the magazine covers that you see here, it's for a guy who, although he did serve in the Korean War, did something else that made him much more famous, and that was to be the first person to orbit the Earth. That's John Glenn. So if you look at this photograph, this is coming back from a mission. He got the nickname Magnet Ass, and that was because he took so much. A lot of the missions that he was flying, combat missions in Korea, were very low to the ground because he's supporting ground troops. And the problem is that when you fly low, it's easy to get shot at by the enemy. And so he had a couple times where he had, more than 100 or 200 holes in his airframe when he landed. And so was fortunate to survive. He flew for a time with a Marine reservist, Ted Williams, the baseball player, and he's credited with shooting down 3 Russian MiGs in 1953, just before the war ended. And had some other, these are some photographs from his funeral. He's buried not too far from the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And that was in December of 2016 when he was buried. Now, before we go to the next one, there are a few other famous Korean War veterans, but who are not buried at Arlington. And I just want to mention their names. So these ones that I'm mentioning are not buried at Arlington, but they are people whose names you've probably heard. Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, flew 78 combat missions in Korea. Buzz Aldrin flew 66 combat missions in Korea. And Johnny Cash served in Germany in the army during the Korean War, where he was a high-speed Morse code intercept operator. And it's where he started writing songs. Now, the next person
What about Douglas MacArthur? He's not buried at Arlington.
No, the interesting thing is that MacArthur's father and brother are both buried at Arlington. But MacArthur is buried in Norfolk.
Virginia.
And there's a whole story about why that is, but I don't really have time for that now.
We'll save that for part 2.
We'll save that for later. I want to talk about a civilian. This is a woman by the name of Margaret Higgins Hall. She had gone to the University of California in Berkeley and then had a master's degree in Columbia in journalism. And she was she worked for the New York Herald Tribune and went to Europe towards the end of the Second World War. And she wrote about she witnessed the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp. And she witnessed and wrote about the Nuremberg trials in Germany after the war. Now, in 1950, she is assigned to the Tribune's Tokyo bureau. So she is in Tokyo in June of 1950 when the war breaks out. And she's very interested in going to get as close to the action so she can report on the war. So she does that. And she makes several trips back and forth between Korea and Japan in those early months. And she actually meets Douglas MacArthur on one of those flights and talks to him and explains that she's a reporter. Well, as time goes on, Walton Walker, who is heading the 8th Army on the ground in Korea, finds out that there's an American woman reporter near the front line. And he says, no, the Army can't take any time to take care of women. She has to go, she has to leave. We can't have any women reporters in Korea. Well, the problem was that she knew Walker's boss. So she contacts MacArthur and says, hey, I think I should be able to stay here and do my job. MacArthur agrees and says that the ban on women correspondents in Korea has been lifted and allowed her to stay and report on the war. She's with a pool of 5 male war correspondents, and that group wins the 1951 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting. So she becomes the first woman to receive the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting because of that award. She would go on to report about the Vietnam War, but then would die kind of early in 1966 at age 45. she is buried at Arlington because her husband was an Air Force general. And even as late as 2010, the South Korean government awarded her the Order of Diplomatic Service Merit, one of its highest awards, to honor her bravery in publicizing the situation of Korea in those early years of the war.
Harry, I'll add, she's also was an author, and if you want to learn more about her experiences in Korea and Vietnam, you can look her up on the internet, like Amazon and stuff has her publications.
Right.
Fascinating person.
So I want to mention there were about 145 medals of honor awarded to Korean war veterans. About 26 are buried at Arlington. And of course, I have, we'll talk about a couple. That's really all I have time for. But I wanted to mention John Kevin Kolish because he has sort of an interesting sort of distinction with respect to the Medal of Honor. He was the first helicopter pilot to be awarded the Medal of Honor. And like Robert said, we usually think about helicopters in association with the Vietnam War, but he had flown combat aircraft, fixed-wing aircraft during the Second World War, and then became a helicopter pilot for the Korean War. And I'll read just a little bit about why he was awarded the Medal of Honor. One of the missions that these helicopter pilots had was to rescue airmen. And, if an aircraft got shot down, they think they could get the pilot, they would send a helicopter to go and pick up the pilot. And that's what his mission was. This was late in the afternoon, July 3rd, 1951. He's responding to a distress call from a Corsair pilot that had been shot down. And this pilot had parachuted out and had survived his plane crashing. So Kolish is given the assignment to go and to try to find him. But there was a thick fog and made it very difficult to find the pilot. And the enemy was nearby, and they were shooting at the helicopter. So they find the pilot, and so there's Kolish and his co-pilot and this Corsair pilot. They get into the helicopter, but the helicopter crashes. They're hiding in the mountains from enemy patrols for 3 days. They start marching to the coast. Within 6 days, they're captured by the enemy. During his captivity, he's beaten and abused. Kolish refused to aid his captors or submit to interrogation, and his bravery inspired his fellow prisoners. He dies of malnutrition and dysentery in October of 1951 while he was a prisoner of war. And he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in Korea. Now, this is Cornelius Charlton. And, Robert mentioned, or you saw the headline earlier when he was talking about the war that Truman had wiped out segregation in the military. Well, what Truman actually did was in 1948, he signed an executive order, 9981, to try to get rid of segregation in the military. And one of the big issues, or one of the problems with the military in terms of race relations, was that the last Medal of Honor that had been awarded to an African American had been in the Spanish-American War. There were no medals of honor, and while there were thousands of African American troops that served in both the First and Second World War, at the time of their actions that might be regarded as worthy of a Medal of Honor, none were awarded. And it's in the Korean War that the Army will award the Medal of Honor to an African American soldier, to two during the Korean War, for their actions at that time. And I'll read you, Cornelius Charlton is born in West Virginia in July of 1929. He's the 8th of 17 children. And he enlists in the Army after the Second World War, right after the Second World War. In 1950, he's in Japan, and he's occupation duty. He's got an administrative job. But when the war broke out, he really wanted to go to the front line to serve. And so he is assigned to a frontline unit. And I'm going to read a little bit about what happened. On June 2nd, 1951, C Company moved to capture Hill 543 near the village of Chipo-ri. Hill was protected by heavily entrenched Chinese infantry, as well as mortars at the top of the hill. During their first attempt to advance up the hill, the company took heavy casualties, and the 3rd platoon leader was mortally wounded. Charlton took command of the platoon, reorganized it for another attack. Heavy fire eventually forced the company back down the hill. 3 times, Charlton led the platoon up the hill in the face of intense Chinese mortars and infantry fire. In spite of mounting casualties, the platoon made slow progress. Charlton single-handedly destroyed 2 Chinese positions, killed 6 Chinese soldiers with rifle fire and grenades. During one advance, Charlton was wounded in the chest, but refused medical treatment and pushed the company forward. Charlton continued to lead the attack from the front of the platoon and several times was separated from the unit. Subsequent accounts noted Charlton continued the advance, holding his chest wound with one hand and an M1 carbine with the other. Under Charlton's leadership, the platoon managed to overcome the Chinese infantry position, but it spotted a Chinese bunker on the far side of the top of the hill where the Chinese mortars were firing on them. As recounted by Private First Class Ronald Holmes, one of the men of the platoon, Charlton decided to destroy the bunker with his last known words, "Let's go." He urged the platoon forward, charged at the front of the formation ahead of the rest of the soldiers. In one final action, he advanced alone on the top of the hill and the location of the Chinese mortars, firing repeatedly on the encampment there. The Chinese troops wounded Charlton one final time with a grenade, but he continued firing until the position was destroyed. Charlton subsequently died with the wounds inflicted by the grenade. He is credited with saving much of his platoon, which had been under heavy fire from the mortars. So obviously well deserved of the Medal of Honor. He was originally buried in West Virginia. The family claims that he wasn't given the honor of being buried at Arlington, but he was reinterred at Arlington in recent years.
Harry, quick question. So he received the Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart. What's the difference between those two for someone who might not be familiar with those?
So the Medal of Honor is for actions in combat. And it has to be sort of above and beyond, what a normal person might do. The Purple Heart is for being wounded in combat. And so no matter how, and of course, those who are killed in combat are also, their families are awarded the Purple Heart. And the Medal of Honor was created in the Civil War. Actually, George Washington had the idea for the Purple Heart going way back to the Revolutionary War. And so that idea of honoring soldiers that have been wounded in combat has been around for a long time.
Okay, thank you. And this was his funeral service. Why was this so recent?
At Arlington, because he was reinterred several times, actually. So he was originally buried in West Virginia, or at a family church cemetery. But when the family realized that he could be buried at Arlington, they decided that they wanted that.
Okay.
Now, one of the other interesting stories that I came across is with these two men. On the left is Jesse Brown, and on the right is Thomas Hudner. Now, you may have heard of the Tuskegee Airmen. So the United States Army Air Force, the Air Force was under the Army during the Second World War, had a program for training African-American pilots for the Army Air Force. And they did that successfully, and they had a very successful unit. The Navy, however, did not have such a program, and they only started training African-American pilots for naval service after the Second World War. And Jesse Brown, it turns out, was the first African-American pilot. He went to Ohio State, got into a Navy ROTC program, and then into naval training. And he was the first African-American pilot, official African-American pilot for the United States Navy. Now, he was from a little town in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The story was that his father had taken him to an air show when he was very young. And he was determined from being a very young person that he wanted to learn how to fly, and so would become a naval pilot. Again, goes to Ohio State, and then gets into aviation cadet training program being run by the Navy. Now, he ends up on an aircraft carrier with this other man, Thomas Hudner. Hudner was from Massachusetts, kind of a wealthy family. But they're in the same squadron together, where they are going to fly off aircraft carrier, and to, again, like John Glenn, they're flying these Corsairs that have that distinctive sort of bent wing looking. This was one of the main aircraft from the Second World War, single pilot. And they're providing low air support, ground support, trying to support troops. And they're flying into North Korea in December of 1950 to support troops that are being attacked by the Chinese. This is when the Chinese have crossed the border and are attacking the Allies in the northern part of Korea at the time. Well, so they take off for this mission. And what happens is that Brown's plane gets damaged through fire from the ground, and he crashes into the mountains in North Korea. And so Hudner and the other squadron members are calling desperately on the radio. They can see that Brown's plane is burning, and they're telling him on the radio, look, you have to get out of your plane. It's going to crash. This is an artist's rendering. And on the left, you see the plane kind of sticking into the snow. That's Brown's plane. Hudner does something that you're not supposed to do, but he takes it on himself. He's desperate to save his friend, Jesse Brown. And so he makes the decision to try to crash land his Corsair in the mountains of northern Korea to see if he can save his friend. And so he does that. He successfully crash lands. He gets out of his plane and tries to help Jesse. Well, Jesse's legs are pinned in there. A helicopter pilot comes that can rescue the pilots, but they cannot get Jesse Brown out of his aircraft, and he is dying. And so the pilot, the helicopter pilot says, look, we have to go because there are enemy troops in this area. Jesse Brown dies, and they leave. Hudner gets back to the aircraft carrier and is desperate to get back to retrieve his friend's body. But there are too many enemy troops around, and they can't risk going back to retrieve it. Now, Hudner had really disobeyed protocol by crash landing his plane and trying to do what he did. So he didn't know, if he was going to be court-martialed or something bad was going to happen. President Truman decided to award him the Medal of Honor for what he did. And so he did receive the Medal of Honor. Now, he would go, this Hudner died in 2017, and these are pictures from his funeral. But a few years before he died, Hudner actually went back to North Korea to see if they could find the remains of Jesse Brown, anything that remained from him, because this, the military is always looking to recover American remains from previous wars. And the North Koreans told him the weather was too bad and they weren't going to let him go. But he remembered his friend for a very long time, and tried to honor his sacrifice. So on the left in this photograph, what you see is a memorial to Jesse Brown in Hattiesburg. Jesse Brown's remains are still in North Korea somewhere. That is a memorial to him in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is where he's from. And you see the picture of the ship on the bottom. So that was a Navy ship that was named the USS Jesse L. Brown. And Thomas Hudner is buried at Arlington. If I do my Medal of Honor tour, which I would like to next spring, we'll go to see Hudner's gravestone. You'll see on Hudner's gravestone that in the middle, the emblem is that star, and that's the Naval Medal of Honor image. Now, one of the people that Jesse inspired is this man named Frank Peterson. And it turns out that Frank Peterson he knew the story about Jesse Brown becoming a pilot. And so he wanted to be a Marine pilot. And so Frank Peterson will then rise up through the ranks in the Marine Corps, and he will become the first African-American general of the United States Marine Corps. And he would fly quite a few combat missions, both in Korea and in the Vietnam War. So he's another person who, sort of an important story from the, I don't know, he would rise to the rank of lieutenant general, which is a 3rd star. I don't know if he actually, when this photograph was actually taken, so I don't know if he's getting his 2nd or 3rd star in that photo. He would die in 2015. Now, I want to mention another woman, but this time one that actually served in the military. And this is Ruby Bradley, Colonel Ruby Bradley. She is considered one of the most decorated women in United States military history, a native of Spencer, West Virginia, but lived in Falls Church for many years. She entered the United States Army Nurse Corps as a surgical nurse in 1934. Some of you may know the story about the nurses who were in the Philippines who were captured by the Japanese. So she was one of them and survived that, and then continued as a nurse in the Korean War. And the story from the Korean War about her is that she was the nurse for the 171st Evacuation Hospital, chief nurse, in November of 1950. And she's trying to get wounded soldiers into an aircraft so they can leave the area. And the story was that the Chinese troops were closing in on her. They were yelling at her to get into the aircraft. And as she was running from the ambulance, a rocket hit the ambulance and destroyed it, but she survived and got into the aircraft with the wounded men. In 1951, she was named chief nurse for the 8th Army, where she supervised 500 Army nurses throughout Korea. And in 1958, she was promoted to the rank of colonel. She was the 3rd woman in the US Army to become a colonel. Retired from the Army in 1963, she had received 34 medals for her service between World War II and Korea. She then began a 17-year civilian nursing career. She died at the age of 94 in 2002. And she's buried in a section which is informally referred to as the nurses section, which is kind of behind, sort of to the west of the tomb of the unknown soldier. So Ruby Bradley had kind of an amazing career. And the last person I want to mention specifically is the man who took over from Walton Walker, and this is Matthew Ridgway. And so when Walker died from the accident in 1950, Ridgway was tapped to take his role as the on-ground commander of the 8th Army. And he was very highly respected Army officer. He had been one of the airborne generals to land at Normandy on D-Day, and had really quite an amazing career. He was a commanding officer of the 82nd Airborne, and parachuted into Normandy in 1944. And Ridgway was really sort of a tough-minded soldier, but from all accounts, he was very highly respected. And so that when MacArthur was dismissed, he basically assumed that role of overall command in Korea. And just a very well respected for his sort of his forceful understanding and trying to do his best in a difficult situation. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about briefly here is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Now, this, of course, is a very special place at Arlington. And as it turns out, that the anniversary, the first soldier from the First World War was buried 100 years ago. This is a photograph from that event on November 11th, which we now recognize as Veterans Day, of 1921. So this coming Thursday is the 100th anniversary of that event. And the cemetery has some special events planned, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But this photograph is from 100 years ago. Now, so the first unknown was buried in 1921. After the Second World War, the government, the military started thinking about burying an unknown soldier from the Second World War. But the Korean War, came up right away, as Robert pointed out. And so it wasn't until 1958, or the late 50s anyway, that they decided that they would bury both a veteran of the Second World War and the Korean War at the same time. And so this photograph is from that event in May of 1958, when both the unknowns from the unknown from the World War II is on the right, and on the Korean War is on the left. And they were buried at the same time in 1958. And when you see the photograph, so then in 1984, it was decided to bury a soldier from the Vietnam War. And you see the white panels on the right and the left. So on the right is the World War II, and on the left is the Korean War. Now, as it turned out, the Vietnam War, there was some concern that they might know who the unknown from the Vietnam War was. And so it turns out, so in 1998, his remains were, he was disinterred, his remains were taken out, and he was identified. And his family decided to have him reburied at the National Cemetery in St. Louis. And so that particular, so this is the Vietnam War. So instead of just the dates, which are on the other one, the honoring and keeping faith with America's missing servicemen, 1958 to 1975. So that's so the Vietnam War unknown, that crypt is actually empty. But I did want to mention, so the events that are coming next week for the remembrance of the tomb of the 100th anniversary of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, on the 9th and the 10th, which I think is Tuesday and Wednesday, they are allowing the public, that area where you see the black mat where the sentinels are standing, the public can never go there. That area is off limits to the public. Only the guards and the sentinels are there. But on the 9th and the 10th, they are going to allow the public to walk on that area and place flowers to honor the tombs of the unknowns. And you have to go to the Arlington Cemetery website, and you'll see information. I think you have to pick a time to be there, and you have to be registered to be a part of that event. On the 11th, they're going to have a special procession and a flyover in the morning, I think at 9 o'clock. And the public is welcome to attend that. You can't go, the presidential wreath laying is invitation only. But the public will be able to see the procession and the flyover that's going to take place at Arlington on the 11th. So I wanted to just let people know about that event coming up.
And so you have to register on the website?
I don't believe that that's necessary for the 11th, but you do have to register for the 9th and the 10th for the flower ceremony.
Okay. I thought we'd answer some questions at the end, but there was a couple that popped up now that are kind of pertinent. So why don't we take an attempt at this? One person asked, let's see, this was from Barbara, not particularly on topic, but is anyone doing any genetic DNA genealogical research to see if they can actually identify the other unknown soldiers?
I know that idea comes up every once in a while, but I don't think that that's going to happen.
Just because they'd have to take the bodies out, and
right,
maybe
yeah,
they could figure out who it is. Maybe they
you're
could.
right, yeah. And the process by which those people were chosen, they don't even know that, they took unknown remains from different battlefields. So there would be no sort of paper trail to even think about who they might be. So I just don't think that's going to happen.
Okay, no problem. Let's see, I did want to mention something real quick. Hold on just a second. I wanted to mention that Harry every month leads our history book discussion. And so for November, they're going to be talking about Enemy of All Mankind. So we kind of try and keep this group a little bit smaller. So we only post it on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture meetup site. But if you're interested in joining a fascinating book discussion that Harry and one or two of his colleagues leads, you can look that up. I pasted the link for our meetup site in the Zoom chat section. Harry, anything you want to add about the Enemy of All Mankind
No,
discussion?
It's late 17th century pirate history. And I don't lead the discussions I'm alternating with Dave Kramer, who leads them on alternate months. So, but I'll be leading this month's discussion. So.
Okay. And then what book are you guys doing in December?
In December, we are doing, it's on the website.
It's the McKinley assassination.
Oh,
book,
that's right. It's the President and the Assassin. And it's about the assassination of William McKinley.
Okay, excellent. So if you want to check that out, that's our monthly history book discussion. Let me get back to our presentation. Hold on a second. So again, if you're interested in history book discussion, I pasted the link in the Zoom chat. Let's continue on. So let's talk about the Korean War Veterans Memorial now that you got all that historical contextual information. So the memorial was dedicated on July 27th, 1995. The designer of it was Frank Gaylord. He made the sculptures, which are the most well-known part of the memorial, but there's actually 4 separate components, soon to be 5. There's 19 stainless steel statues. There's a mural wall. There's the United Nations wall, and then a pool of remembrance. So let's talk about these items. I thought what I want to do first is I wanted you to be able to hear from the architect, the designer of these sculptures, the memorial. But let's see, let me go look at some of the pictures first. I'm guessing that most people are probably familiar with what the memorial looks like. But since we have a group of folks from outside the United States, just want to make sure. So this is, we'll talk more about this in just a little bit, but let me show you these pictures just so you can get a sense of what we're referring to. And then I'll go back and play the audio interview of the designer of these statues. This is not the only facet of the Korean memorial, but it's the most well-known section. And we'll talk more about these in just a bit. So just kind of a sneak preview. All right, now let's go back and hear from the designer of that section of the memorial.
They are on an undefined mission. This all takes place in one moment of time. There's no particular narration except that they are all alert. They're all combat men. Every branch of the service is there. And every nationality in our own country who fought in the Korean War. I can identify with it because I have gotten up in the morning, crawled out of my hole, and walked into mortal combat in World War II. So I can identify with what these men are doing. They're not in an attack formation, but they are in enemy territory. They're frightened, they're tired, they're hungry, but they're performing because they're well trained.
Okay, and that was the voice of Frank Gaylord. He designed the sculptures at the memorial. I didn't post the link in the Zoom chat like I said I did. I didn't hit enter, so thanks for the folks who mentioned that. So it's in the Zoom chat now, the link for the book discussion. And here is another short video from the memorial. Okay, let's talk more about the memorial now that you've seen a little bit about it. The site is managed by the National Park Service, and this is a little limited because of COVID, but traditionally what they would do is periodically offer tours or talks at this site. The picture here is showing our friend Michael Draper of the National Park Service, and this was a tour that he gave to our history group pre-COVID. So they typically have rangers on site, especially during tourist season, maybe not 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, but it's not uncommon to see park rangers there. And so if you're ever passing through here and want to know more about the site, really recommend checking in with them. They're happy to provide information. They hand out these brochures that describe the memorial. So it has a lot of information in a kind of very concise format, describing the site in a little more detail. So make sure you pick up one of these. They have these at a kiosk stand that's not very far, maybe like a, I don't know, 60-second walk from the memorial. And here are some pictures. So it's on the National Mall. You can see the Lincoln Memorial in the background. And these are a series of 19 men moving forward. These are stainless steel statues that are slightly larger than life. This is a breakout of the figures and what their role is. You can see there's 19 of them. 14 are from the Army, 3 are from the Marines, 1 is from the Air Force, and 1 is from the Navy. Here are the positions. These are from the front. So you can see this very first one here, and then it goes back in order. So positions 1 through 19, the service branch, what type of role they're filling, lead scout, scout, squad leader, BAR man, et cetera, et cetera. It has their race, all different races represented, and then the type of weapon they're carrying. Of course, they're carrying weapons that would have been common, used by personnel during the Korean War. So these figures all have very specific kind of role and background, not just randomly placed there. When you talk to people that have been to Washington, D.C., this is often listed as one of people's favorite memorials. There are so many monuments and memorial in Washington, D.C., whether it's the Vietnam War, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, et cetera, et cetera. This is frequently up at the top of people's favorites, if it's not at the very top. It's one of my personal favorites. I think Harry's as well. One of the things that's also unique about it, really looks different depending on what's going on outside. So it looks different depending on the season or the time of day or what's happening with the atmosphere as far as rains or clouds or sun. So if you get a chance, if you haven't visited Washington, D.C. before, if you haven't seen this memorial, I always recommend going to see the sites both in the day and in the evening, because it just has a really different feel. And people talk about how eerie this site is in the evening, especially if it's a little bit quieter, like maybe not as eerie in the summer when there's a lot of tourists, but if there's not as many people here, it can be very eerie. Now, this site is undergoing renovation. They're kind of restoring some of the items here, including the statuary. This picture kind of gives you a essence of what it looks like at night. A lot of the memorials and monuments in Washington, D.C., if you've not been to our nation's capital, are lit up at night and really beautiful to see. So if you go here in the day and then come back later in the evening or on a subsequent visit in the evening, the site just has a really different feel to it. Not just this one, but a lot of the monuments memorials. Same thing for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, same thing for the Lincoln Memorial. So if you get a chance and you're going to be visiting DC, or if you're already here now, make sure you do that. Something cool to do. Some fall colors going on in this photo. I thought this was a really cool photo because cold weather and snow plays an important part of the Korean War story. And the memorial's open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It is interesting to go in off season to see what things are like outside. You can see the soldiers are marching towards the American flag. So that's also a nice touch. When you visit these monuments, memorials in DC, they oftentimes have a lot of symbolism associated with them. Some of it's very clear to see, some of it takes a little bit more kind of analysis, but when they put these things together, there's typically not, they're not done randomly. There's thought put behind these. And so the troops marching towards the American flag, marching towards freedom, marching towards home, represents that. Another well-known part of the memorial, which is really cool, is this reflecting wall. And these are images that were engraved on the wall. And so there's 19 statues, and when they reflect off the wall, they're doubled to create 38, and 38 is a very important number in the Korean War. There's the 38th parallel, of course, and then also the war lasted 38 months. And so half of 38 is 19, and there's 19 soldiers. They didn't have enough space to make 38 soldiers. The soldiers, as mentioned earlier, are a little bit larger than life. The sculptor thought that if they were a little bit larger than life, that would be more impactful, but he didn't want to make them too large where they just seemed out of place. And the thing that's really noteworthy is just the human expression, the faces on these sculptures, really amazing to see. They're all very unique and very different. Some close-ups of those. They look very tense and on alert as they move forward. And the reflecting wall. These were historic photographic images which were placed on the wall. They're not identifying any particular person, so like you're not going to see Douglas MacArthur's photo on the wall itself. But that being said, they were actual photos of actual people. This is cool. These are people that are volunteers, and their job is to help out and keep the memorial clean. And so that's what they're doing here. They do a similar thing at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The troops and the photos and the support personnel are in very specific order. So this is the whole entire mural from left to right over here. And then you can see this is the key that tells you which sections are represented. So artillery, armor, chaplains, fighter, bombers, et cetera, Army, Air Force, Navy, and of course that includes the Marines. People really, I think when people visit this site for the first time, they're expecting to see the sculptures because they've heard about them or they've seen photos of them. But what I find is people really fascinated by this wall. They maybe knew that was there, but it really kind of captivates them, and they actually spend quite a bit of time studying all these pictures. That's been my experience taking people here for the first time. As mentioned earlier, there were a number of other countries besides this, the United States and South Korea, that fought in the Korean War, both in terms of supplying combat forces and then also humanitarian aid. And this is a reflecting pool to recognize those that lost their lives. Usually in memorials in places like Washington, D.C., there's two types of water features. There's rushing water, or flowing water, and that usually represents victory and triumph and things like that. When you see still water like this, that usually represents a time of reflection and remembrance. And so because this water here is not flowing, it's stationary, it's a pool of remembrance for those who lost their lives defending democracy in Korea. Here's another view. Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Famous saying, freedom is not free. You have to pay a price for it. And so we kept kind of talking about this, kind of referring back to this. For the United States, was the Korean War a win, a loss, or a tie? Again, a rhetorical question, opinion strictly up to you. As mentioned at the start of our program, this is a three-part series. So tomorrow, Harry and I are going to be talking about the Vietnam War and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. If you want to join us for that, feel free to do so. It'll have different Zoom information, so you can sign up for that on Eventbrite or Meetup, and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time. And then in early December, our program is on Pearl Harbor Memorial in Hawaii for the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So hopefully you can join us for that. If you've always wanted to go to Hawaii, but have never been able to do so, now you can visit from the comfort of your own home. in early December. We'll actually have this program on the Pearl Harbor Memorial more than once. So it'll be at different days and times if you want to join us for that. Before, there was a couple more short videos I wanted to play. Before we do that, Harry, didn't get a chance. Anything you would like to add about the memorial? We didn't get a chance to discuss yet.
Oh, no, I think I'm good.
If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A or the comment section in Facebook. So this is the first of two final videos we're going to play before we call it an evening. This one was actually made in Korea. So let me cue this one up. As far as the casualty figures go in the war on the southern side and South Korea's allies, in total for all forces, South Korean, American, and allies, 170,927 killed, 32,585 missing, and 566,434 wounded. Just strictly for the United States, since we're an American-based organization, the casualty figures for the United States military in Korea: 36,574 killed, 103,284 wounded, and 4,714 missing in action, still unaccounted for. And thanks so much for joining us. And again, kind of talked about this rhetorical question of the United States: was the Korean War a win, a loss, or a tie? What do you think? Hopefully you got a little bit different perspective about the war. And let's close with one more video for the evening. Okay, that's the end of the formal portion of our program. Thank you so much for joining us. Greatly appreciate that. And special thanks to our special guest, Harry. I thought what we would do is we have a few minutes, although we're running longer than normal. But why don't we answer a few questions? If anyone has any, they can type them in the Zoom chat or the Q&A or the comment section on Facebook. And Harry, a question came in earlier about the awarding of medals for people that served in Korea. Is that something that's still happening to this day, or do you envision that continuing to happen in the future?
Yeah, so this happens along the way. Um, the president and there are several, and the Congress, I think, are authorized to request the military to look at records of particular soldiers and the actions that they did during various wars, to see if they don't deserve to receive the Medal of Honor. So you see this happens not a lot, but usually in every presidential administration. I was talking about for instance, African American soldiers from the First World War and the Second World War have been awarded in the Clinton and Obama and I think the George W. Bush administrations. So yes, so this is an ongoing process.
Okay. Let's see. Interesting question came in. Do you think Korea will ever be unified? I would tend to think yes, although maybe not in the near future. But that's just strictly my opinion. I mean, it seems like that's the way a lot of countries end up going. And I don't think anyone ever thought the two Germanys would get together, and they did. So will Korea ever unify? If I had to guess, I'd say at some point in time. My own personal opinion is yes. I don't know if that'll be next month, next year, or 100 years from now, but I would think maybe at some point in time they would. But what do you think, Harry?
Something will have to change in the leadership of the North Korean government.
Yeah, good point.
And probably something drastic, but that's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, there would have to be some major shifts taking place before that would end up transferring. And then there was another question from earlier. What do you like so much about the Korean War Memorial? So I'll go first, then Harry, I'll let you answer. I guess I really like the sculptures. I just think they're really fascinating. They're very lifelike, and the facial expression. I also really like the wall that has all the photographic images is very moving. And then I also like the fact that it changes a lot, the look of it, whether it's the day or the night or different seasons of the year or the different atmospheric conditions, whether it's sunny or cloudy or rainy. So those are kind of some things that stick out in my mind. It's a very unique memorial. It doesn't look like anything else that I've seen. I forgot to mention earlier, they're actually expanding it, and they're going to add a list of names of those who lost their lives in the Korean War, kind of like how they've done with the Vietnam War. But Harry, what about yourself? What do you like about this memorial?
Yeah, of course, what's sort of interesting is that it was created after the Vietnam Memorial. And so you can see that they sort of took the idea of the wall, but instead of putting names on it, they decided to etch photographs into it. And it's sort of interesting because when you think about statues in terms of with respect to war memorials, this one is so interesting because it's trying to make sort of a realistic depiction of what you might have seen if you were actually there, right? A lot of the Civil War memorials are guys on horses and that kind of thing. But this is sort of a depiction of what you might have seen if you had actually been in Korea in 1951 or 2 or something. So
what about someone said, looking ahead, is there any talk of having a memorial for the Persian Gulf War endeavors? Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, well, I know there is always discussion about these things. One thing that I didn't get a chance to talk to you about, Colin Powell was buried at Arlington, right? And he's buried
No,
in
I actually
section.
didn't know that. So I've been offline most of the day, and
Yeah,
I've been
okay.
kind of
Well,
looking to see if there was any news about that. And
I
last I
saw
heard,
that, because they had the service at the cathedral, right?
Mhm, I saw that
Uh,
part.
yeah, so he's buried in section 60, and section 60 is one of the newer sections of the cemetery, and it's where a lot of Iraq and Afghanistan veterans are buried. And a lot of how like people left things at the wall at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, like medals and letters and things. That section 60 has become kind of like that at Arlington, because it's where soldiers are buried who people know personally, right? Wives and children and parents, so that section has almost become, something like that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks for that news update. I've actually been following that to see, because I saw shortly after he passed away that they said that he was going to have the service at Washington National Cathedral, but I didn't ever see any news information about where he was going to be buried. I assumed that it was going to be there, but I never actually saw that. I imagine it was a private ceremony with just for the family, close family, since that's the way the cathedral was not open to the public. Is that the case?
I believe that's the case. Yeah, I don't believe it was announced before, because I was looking to see if there had been any announcement beforehand, but I didn't see any.
Oh, okay, let's see. Um, just to go back to the book club, how do you end up picking the book club discussion of books? And then, so what for someone who's not familiar, what exactly is a history book club discussion meeting for someone who's never been to such
Yeah,
a?
so every month it's a book club discussion that used to be in person before COVID, but since COVID started, we have we use Zoom, and we at least a month ahead we put out the title, and then either Dave or I are going to alternate now in leading the discussions. But it's a very small. We do take suggestions, like from people, um, about books that they want to read, but there's a small group of us that kind of decide, and we try to alternate between U.S. history and international history. Um, so those are, sort of the general parameters.
Oh, okay, so these programs are more of like a one directional talk, whereas these events are more if someone actually wants to talk about history with other people and kind of compare notes on things and
Yeah,
debates.
so right. So we do, yeah, the Zoom is open for discussion. I run a very tight ship, so if there are a lot of people who have a lot to say, I might make people raise hands and that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, it's an open discussion.
Okay, and then this is the one in December. It's on Tuesday, December 14th at 6 o'clock Eastern. The December History Book Club discussion, The President and the Assassin by Scott
That's
Miller.
that's 6 o'clock Central. It's
Oh,
actually
sorry, I'm in, yeah, sorry, that's
7 Eastern. Yeah.
I forgot I'm in Central Time Zone. So, okay, thought I would share that. Let's see, are there any other questions that have come up before we call it a night? Let's see.
I was going to mention one thing, that that you talked about how the United Nations decided to prosecute the war to defend the South, and of course the Security Council had to vote on that. And technically, the Soviet Union was a member of the Security Council, but they had actually been boycotting the Security Council since January over the issue of the who represented China in the Security Council, which at the time was Taiwan and not mainland China. And and remember, the communists had just taken over in 1949 in China. So the Russians kind of defeated themselves by not being at that Security Council meeting that voted on, you know, supporting the South Koreans in the fight in Korea.
Oh yeah, interesting to think how history might have turned out differently. So, well, I think that's enough for one evening. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about a lot of different things, answered a lot of questions. So why don't we call it a wrap? So thanks to everyone for joining us. Again, special thanks to Harry for coming and contributing his knowledge. And if you want to join us again tomorrow, same time, not exactly the same place. It'll have a different Zoom connection link, but we're doing the same type of program, but it's going to be on the Vietnam War and the Vietnam Memorial in honor of Veterans Day, which is this coming Thursday. So thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your evening and a great rest of your weekend. And hopefully we'll either see you tomorrow or at the History Book Club discussion or some other endeavor in the near future. So thanks everyone. Take care. Stay safe. See you next time. Bye.
Bye.